So, I will start us with a poem, as I usually do. This one is called Despair by Billy Collins. Sorry. So much gloom and doubt in our poetry, flowers wilting on the table, the self regarding itself in a watery mirror. Dead leaves cover the ground, the wind moans in the chimney, and the tendrils of the yew tree inch toward the coffin. I wonder what the ancient Chinese poets would make of all this, these shadows and empty cupboards. Today, with the sun blazing in the trees, my thoughts turn to the great 10th century celebrator of experience, Wahoo, whose delight in the smallest things could hardly be restrained, and to his joyous counterpart in the western provinces, Yeehaw. Okay. No one laughed. All right, I'm pleased to few chuckles. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Sara Bronin. She's the chair in real property and law, the faculty director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Connecticut School of Law. She is not only an attorney, but an architect whose scholarly research examines property, land use, historic preservation, green building, and renewable energy law. She's one of the foremost scholars in two rapidly evolving areas of law, historic preservation and renewable energy, including microgrids. And in 2016, Professor Bronin was a finalist for the Connecticut Law Tribune Attorney of the Year Award and UConn Law School's nominee for the university-wide Teaching Innovation Award. Outside the classroom, she serves as an expert witness. She's a consultant to cities and state agencies. She chairs the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, co-chairs Hartford's Climate Stewardship Council, and chairs the Connecticut Urban League Initiative. So she's a bit busy. We're happy to have her here this summer, where she is our distinguished scholar in energy. And she is going to be speaking to us today on a model zoning code, advancing energy and environment, the Hartford example. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bronin.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction. Okay, so thank you so much for having me today. Can I just use this now? Okay. All right. I didn't know if I should speak into this. Great. So thanks for that nice introduction. Thanks to Vermont Law School for having me here. You do have a Hartford, Vermont, I guess, so not to be confused with Hartford, Vermont. I'm talking today about Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm excited to do so because I think Hartford, as a New England city, doesn't, it could use some good news, and I think the zoning code is good news for Hartford and a model for other places. So here's Hartford. How many people here have been to Hartford? Okay, a few of you have been to Hartford. Excellent. So you know some of the great assets of our city. This is a picture of from a downtown office building looking out over Bushnell Park to some of the rest of the city. The city is really compact. It has 18 square miles and about 125,000 people. We have a lot of great assets. A couple of things that we are struggling with right now are some municipal budgeting problems and also income and social inequality that is reflected in the demographics of Hartford neighborhoods. But I wanted to talk today about some of the great physical assets that we have and how that shaped our approach to the zoning code. So I'll get to that in just a minute. So one of the things, for those of you who haven't been to Hartford, that we do have is a vibrant downtown. So we have not only tall buildings. Here's a big apartment building, Hartford 21 on the right, but we also have a number of historic buildings that still exist downtown and that are pretty well utilized with a range of uses. Outside of the downtown, we have some really amazing compact walkable neighborhoods. Some people say, I've heard that Hartford has the most number of Register designated buildings per capita of any city in the country, and you see historic buildings everywhere, and it's a wonderful asset for Hartford because, of course, the way that we've been building, the way that we build now is not necessarily as good as the way that we used to build in terms of materials, quality, the human experience. So we see some of that great architecture here. Further on the point of historic character, I mean, really, actually, the last slide talked about historic character, but it was really meant to talk about the fact that our neighborhoods were developed in the way that we developed historic neighborhoods, which had walkable commercial spines within a few blocks of any residence in the city. So you see on the top left Park Street, you see on the top right Albany Avenue, and you see some other neighborhoods, the West End and Parkville in the bottom slides. So just drilling down on the point of historic character, we have some buildings that you might recognize. So anybody recognize the top left building? This is what you see when you drive down I-91 through Hartford, the Colt Dome. And that building has had a series of failed developers, but has been now in the hands of a great developer and has been really revitalized and looks great. So you don't see the boarded up windows off of I-91 anymore, a symbol of Hartford's hopeful renaissance. You see some other buildings that have historic character. Among our other assets is that we have great access to transit and biking. So we're a really small city, like I said, very compact, very dense neighborhoods, but we have a robust public transportation system. We have a really strong biking community. So you see on the bottom left a bike valet. This is probably, par for the course here in Vermont. I know there's a lot of that those efforts here, but in Connecticut, there's not that many cities that focus on biking, and especially not that many urban cities. So we have tried to do that. We just were awarded a bike-friendly community award, which is a big deal. There's only 7 communities in Connecticut that have been awarded that, and we even gave ourselves a cake. Again, our natural assets, what do we care about in Hartford? Well, it's clear that historically, people in the city have cared about our natural assets, and specifically our public parks and our rivers. So top left and right images, that's a park river, a largely wild river that winds its way through the western end of Hartford, although it has been buried in parts and has been otherwise modified in not so great ways, but some of the things that some of the surface parts of the park river that still remain are pretty great. And then on the right, you have the Connecticut River, which is the first and only national blueway in the country, and that runs directly adjacent to, I'll show you on the map, a landfill to the north, then downtown, then a bunch of industrial complexes to the south. We have the first municipal rose garden in the country in Elizabeth Park, and then on the bottom right, you see Bushnell Park, the park that was shown in the first slide, the second slide, which is the oldest public park in the country. Okay, so I'm here to talk about zoning codes. So zoning codes are, as you know, documents that control everything that gets built in a city. I was talking with some of my colleagues here and the Vermont Law School faculty about zoning and the power of zoning here in Vermont. And zoning may not be used as a tool in lots of the towns here, at least in the way that it's used in some large cities. But in cities the size of Hartford, zoning is a pretty traditional mechanism by which to regulate at the local level the use of land. So our code is somewhat traditional. So we revised our code in January of 2016. And in revising that code, it was about a 3-year effort that involved hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders, lots of meetings, a huge overhaul of a 50-year-old antiquated zoning code that was done at a time where our primary focus when we designed cities was making sure that people could get in their vehicles from one place to another. So you had some pretty undesirable components, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. Our new code is somewhat traditional, so we followed neighborhood plans. So we have here some various plans from neighborhood associations, which had really been actually for decades asking for the zoning commission, the local rules, to be revised to allow for neighborhoods that they thought were more attractive, safer, more mixed use, and more protective of historic character. We hadn't responded to any of those neighborhood planning documents, though, despite having 15 different neighborhood revitalization groups that had pretty much been saying the same thing until we revised this code in 2016. So we changed the zoning code. Zoning is very important. It controls everything that gets built. These are the 4 things that we didn't like about the old code. It was complicated and contradictory. it imposed a lot of costs and time delays on developers. It actually outlawed the compact and walkable neighborhoods that I showed you in the slides earlier on. And what I say, outlawed is that one of the biggest things that it required was parking requirements, which meant that any time you wanted to build a retail store on Park Street or Albany Avenue, you had to have provided an amount of parking that was so outrageous it couldn't possibly even fit on the lot. So those corridors suffered from a lot of disinvestment because there was no way to make it economically viable to build parking on those lots and make the kind of buildings, buildings work there. So you saw a lot of stagnation for 50 years on those avenues. And it didn't protect the natural environment, which I'll talk hopefully most about today. But I did want to run through some of the other goals. So then that translated into, I guess, what we would call our goals. So clarify and modernize the code, reduce development burdens, advance, I hate the term smart growth because what's the opposite of that is dumb growth. I mean, nobody's going to say they're advancing dumb growth, but that kind of is a shorthand for compact, walkable neighborhoods. And then, of course, promote environmental stewardship. So the changes we made within this concept of clarifying and modernizing the code is making it the code clearer and easier to read. That makes it easier to administer. Removing outdated concepts, so I won't talk much about this, but we had words like servants in the zoning code. You're allowed to live with your servants, and who says that, right? Well, we did at City of Hartford until we changed the code. And then a big thing that we did was a form-based code, which actually does have environmental implications. I mean, all of this does because it promotes, it lessens dependence on cars. But just getting to just a couple of things, just to give you an idea of how bad the old code was. In zoning, we have what's called use tables, and so we have, you say, this type of use is allowed in this type of district. So, industrial uses will be allowed in an industrial district. Residential uses will be allowed in a residential district. Our old code, the use table, was 60 pages long, and these are just a few images of it. You have lumber and other building materials being regulated differently from electrical supplies, being regulated differently from paint supplies. Okay, so this really makes no sense because for the most part the land use impacts of you're buying each of these types of uses are not different. So there's no reason to regulate them differently and to allow them in different zones. One of my favorite old parts of the zoning code was that we used to regulate rice factories differently from vermicelli factories, which, why, right? No rational basis for that if we had ever been challenged on that, but we weren't. So the new use table looks something like this. It clarifies exactly which uses can be in which district, and it's 3 pages long. So the filled-in circles are permitted. The half-filled circles on the top are permitted in the upper stories only. In that particular district, the ones on the left are permitted subject to use-specific conditions. And then the blank circles are special permit applications requiring public hearings. So again, I'm just giving you an overview of that so you have a sense of how the new code is structured. Another big thing that we did was focused on the form of buildings. And so in keeping with what we heard through the neighborhood planning process, that people really liked the character of their neighborhood, but they weren't being allowed to recreate that, we looked at how the form of the buildings should be regulated to promote that historic character. So what we did with this was we came up with a mix of building types that were allowed in each district. So here are some examples of building types that we saw already and that we knew that we wanted to replicate. So you see downtown storefronts, and these are pictures of Hartford buildings on the left. And this is actually in our code. So these pictures are, I guess, part of our law. We have a very picture-heavy code, and I don't know, maybe that's because, we had architects on the commission, and we sort of people think in pictures. On the top right is a downtown general building. Here are the storefront building types, and just to give you an idea of what the form-based code says, what it says is, what it regulates is this is just one page of that particular building type. What it regulates is the siding of the building and the height of the building, but it regulates in a different way than a traditional code. For example, in building siding, you might not be able to see it, but 4 lines down, that we have a front build to zone. So what we say in that is that there's a building line on every street that we've established as a planning commission, and that the building has to be built up to, in the case of most storefronts, 2 feet within the building line. So most zoning codes will say you have a setback of 15 feet, and you have to build behind that setback. But what we're saying is, if you're building on Park Street, if you're building on Albany Avenue, you build up to you build to the building line within 2 feet of that. Another thing we regulate now is better is height. So you see under height, minimum overall height requirements, maximum height requirements. So we say between 2 and 4 stories in all but this MS3 zone, which is a very rarely used district, and an auto-oriented district where we allow 1-story buildings. But for the most part, especially on our main streets, we say minimum 2 stories, maximum 4 stories, and we have other regulations as well. So just getting back to this, I mean, this actually has a environmental dimension, even in the form-based code, because what we're saying is we're requiring you to build more dense than you would otherwise have been required to do. So of course, more dense environments, more dense cities means that you have more uses packed together. In the case of the storefront, we anticipate mixed uses, and so we're creating the walkable community that takes cars out of the equation. At least that's our aim. I mean, of course, we live in Connecticut. The reality is many people will still need cars, but we're seeing more and more, especially among the millennials. I mean, the demographic trends are people don't want cars. They want to be able to walk places. And then that goes for senior citizens as well, others who can't afford cars. And so trying to design a city that doesn't rely on car transportation by requiring them to be more dense is something that I think has environmental consequences, and positive ones, hopefully. We also have a chapter that's devoted specifically to streets and street design, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But again, it's a form-based code street design that requires things like bike lanes and sets out buffers and trees, and again, all of these have environmental components. Okay, so reducing development burdens. This is just to give you a sense of the code. This clarity that we have, I think, in the code means that there's a lot of direction for architects and for property owners as to what they can do. There's a lot more uses that are as of right. We were hearing every single thing that came to the downtown district as a special hearing before the code was changed. So if you just wanted to reuse a hotel, an old hotel as a revive it as a hotel, they'd have to come to us for a full public hearing. What we said was, no, we know those uses are going downtown. Here are the rules. Go forth and prosper with your hotel. We still do require public hearings for some controversial uses. In Hartford, those include liquor stores and bars. It also includes civic buildings and stadiums. We have clear process set out in the code. One of the things, again, that has an environmental component that's embedded in this this goal to also reduce development burdens is what we've done on parking. So the parking burdens, we're trying to make a city less dependent on cars. So how do we do that? Not just through the building design, but also through our requirements for parking. So we have a chapter in the code that addresses parking. And what we've said in that code is there are no minimum parking requirements for anything downtown. There are no minimum parking requirements for any retail use or any service use. So a retail use would be a shop. A service use would be a restaurant or a barbershop. There are 50% less parking requirements in what we've called the Transit-Oriented Development Overlay. You can also get out of your parking requirements through lots of parking credits. So I'll just skip to that slide. So we give generous parking credits with, you can stack credits so you don't get, there's no cap on that. If you produce more bicycle parking than you're required to do, if you're near transit, it doesn't even say you have to direct people to transit. If you're near transit, you can cut off some of your parking. If you have zip car on site, if you're an office building and you have a transportation management plan, you can also diminish your parking requirements. So here's the parking chart for cars. We can go over that if needed. Oh, and there are maximums on almost every use. If there are maximums on every use, there are minimums, I should say. There are some minimums for some uses. So, for example, an apartment building built outside of downtown would have some minimums. But we try to make it pretty generous through these parking credits to get out of them. We do ask developers to put up bike racks. So something that we noticed in the city is that we did not have great bike infrastructure, which is why we're promoting street design that includes bike racks, but we're also promoting just the actual installation of bike racks, which we didn't really have that many in the city before, but now we have a requirement for both minimum long-term spaces, which are covered spaces, and short-term spaces. And for some uses, we even have changing facilities and showers. Okay, so if you're going under the smart growth goal, obviously that too has an environmental impact. Transit-oriented development, so I mentioned just a minute ago a transit-oriented development overlay zone, fewer auto-related uses, a craftsman industrial use. Here's the zoning map, the new and the old map. In the old map you had, so anybody know what this pink might have been? I know you can't read it, but I just told you that the Connecticut River was on the eastern side of the city. What kind of industrial zoning is it? It's industrial zoning, okay? So of course in our great wisdom, the prior planners of Hartford zoned the land along the river industrial. And of course with the history of mills and factories along the river, maybe that made sense. Of course we don't want that anymore. So what we tried to do in the new map, just as a very basic measure, to establish what we called the Connecticut River overlay on every part of the land along the river, so that if it ever gets reused, it will have to be redeveloped in a series of uses that are not industrial. And that excludes downtown, because downtown has at least some connectivity to the river in a few spots. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to emphasize here. I think there's another slide on the transit-oriented development districts, but they're basically in this area. You can't see it very well in this photo because they're not one color. It's actually a yellow hash, which you'll never be able to see. But those follow the Connecticut Fast Track line, which is a high-speed transit line that we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars to as a state, connecting Hartford to New Britain and now to East Hartford and beyond. So those have fixed nodes of transit that are suitable for transit-oriented development. So in the transit-oriented development overlay, you can build any of these types of buildings, apartment buildings, row buildings, and then buildings even as tall as you build downtown. So we're hoping, again, adding density to these corridors that right now are full of parking lots and gas stations and other undesirable uses. When you have transit, fixed node transit in the area, we're hoping that that will spur some development. Okay, so just getting to the last goal, because I think that's what, even though all of these other things are embedded in environment, these are maybe the more clearly environmental provisions of our code. We actually have a pretty strong tradition of solar in Hartford. We have, I think, the largest municipal solar array on our landfill. It's 1 megawatt landfill in Connecticut. That was a landfill that was capped just a few years ago, and we quickly developed this solar array up there. There's other solar around the city. That on the bottom right is at Watkinson School and a church. So what do we do in renewable energy? So to promote renewable energy, so like I said, we have some bases in solar. We were actually, along with Austin and some other towns, an inaugural Soul Smart Gold City designated by the Department of Energy last year. So that was pretty great, in part because of our regulations. But we've provided height bonuses for downtown and transit-oriented development buildings if they use a certain percentage of renewable energy. And we tried to make this not so onerous, because not a lot of downtown buildings are going to be able to have a solar array on their roof. So it's actually going to be harder for them to meet goals. But we wanted to at least start making an effort. Or if they use cogeneration, which is combined heat and power. We expressly in the zoning code allowed building-mounted wind and solar in every zoning district. So that includes the historic homes, that includes the industrial complexes, everything in between, we allow it. There are certain rules as to how we would like to see the solar placed on the site, but it's certainly allowed, and I think there's nowhere in the city where it would be prohibited because of our rules. We also anticipate or allow one large-scale wind turbine or more if they can find the right sites along the I-91 corridor. So maybe in addition to the Colt building, you'll be seeing a giant wind turbine at some point. And we allow solar parking canopies in most parking lots. Oh, everything with an asterisk is, the asterisk signifies projects that my law students at UConn Law School researched, presented to the Zoning Commission, and were then adopted into law. So I had a pair of students research renewable energy requirements in zoning everywhere. Then they combined a suggested zoning ordinance using best practices from everywhere and said, could you do this? This is the most. And we said, yeah, we'll do the most, whatever the most is, just keep giving us the most. And so this is over a period of, again, 2 or 3 years worth of student efforts in that. We're probably one of the first localities to require EV charging stations for large lots, or 35 cars, we consider that a large lot. Again, we provide parking credits for sustainably designed parking facilities. We have so another thing that I've written about is, in my research, is solar rights. So the rights to access and harness the rays of the sun. And there's often a conflict, or there have been a few high-profile conflicts between new solar collectors and trees, and new trees. So, you know, which one takes precedence? So, in order to clarify that, you know, in the case of dense Hartford, where we may get some of these conflicts, we said, don't plant a tree that will shade a solar collector. So we tried to put a thumb on the scale of renewable energy in those cases where you have two neighbors that might come into conflict. With a focus on air quality, I've talked a little bit about how we've tried to reduce transportation-related emissions. We've also focused a lot on trees. We have a robust tree ordinance, which requires property owners to obtain permits before they remove certain trees, to replace trees, and that's something that's passed by the City Council. So for the Zoning Commission, we wanted to supplement that through canopy coverage requirements for every use. We expand on the kinds of tree installation, maintenance, construction, and removal, specify a little bit more on that. We wrote all of this in coordination with the City Forester and the Tree Commission. We give downtown and TOD projects density bonuses for green roofs, and we allow, for the first, actually urban agriculture was not allowed at all until we changed it, until we changed the zoning code. Actually, we did a little urban agriculture revision before that because we just said, okay, we just need to do this. But then in the new code, those were expanded and clarified. So community gardens and parks, and urban farming, where we have a single operator, is allowed even in dense Hartford. Looking at water quality, we put in development buffers near waterways. We require or encourage low-impact development and green infrastructure everywhere. And actually, as a sort of follow-on to that, we recently got grant funding to have a green infrastructure specialist for the city and an assistant who will both work together to advance green infrastructure, both in public and private projects. And we will probably be strengthening the green infrastructure requirements of our code to make certain runoff percentages required to be managed on site. We've required less impervious surface coverage. I mentioned the Connecticut River overlay, and we're probably one of the first zoning codes to ban artificial turf, which is really detrimental to the environment with the crumb rubber. It runs off into our streams. There's also huge public health problems with artificial turf too, with kids mostly breathing in that crumb rubber. We've won lots of awards, so we're really proud of those. Hartford doesn't get a lot of awards all the time, so we're really excited when people see changes in what we do. And through the efforts of the zoning code, we developed as a working group of the Planning and Zoning Commission what's called the Climate Stewardship Council. And so actually the top left is the council, and actually these other images are of my students going around and meeting with different people. There they are on top of the landfill, walking along the Connecticut River, up in Keeney Park, our largest park, at 693 acres, a magnificent park. Up there, they're talking with the founder of the Keeney Park Sustainability Project. And our climate action planning process, which will be folded into the next comprehensive plan of development, which the Planning and Zoning Commission runs, will focus on areas that are related, so energy, green space, food, transportation, waste, and water. And you see our mission here, which is not just about the environment, but because Hartford has, it still is really a struggling city. You know, we want to talk about the environment as it relates to the economy, as it relates to public health, as it relates to social equity, and that's what we've tried to do through all of the things that we focus on in the Climate Action Plan. One of the questions that I get, probably should have said this at the very beginning, just one of the questions that I get is how were you able to do this? You know, what authority does the Planning and Zoning Commission have? In Connecticut, unlike every other state, Planning and Zoning Commissions actually have the power to change the zoning regulations themselves. They don't need mayoral approval. They don't need city council approval. So where the charter authorizes it, the Zoning Commission has the final say. And so we took that authority and ran with it. And so one of the ways we've been able to do this is because we have a commission that's fairly interested in promoting Hartford as an environmental leader in New England, in the United States, and in the world, and we have the power to do it. So we're going to, like I said, harness that power and try to continue to push through some of these efforts. And so I guess I'll stop there and leave it open for questions. But as a model for a local government regulation that advances energy and environment, I think this is a good one. And hopefully it can be strengthened even more. So I'll throw it open for questions, if any. Yeah.
The ability to find that in cities a lot of you find in cities a lot of restaurants, right, cafe style seating, and you find drivers being crowded to the point where only more pedestrians are going. So how do you accommodate that kind of use?
So the question, for those who couldn't hear, was how do you, if you're telling people to build up to the building line, what if they have a sidewalk cafe that spills over into the public right-of-way? Well, we have a separate process for outdoor cafes. I mean, so it's an accessory use to an existing restaurant. So the building itself has to be built up to the line. Of course, Hartford, you're not spilling out into the sidewalk for 6 months out of the year. It's a pretty limited use. So the building is the permanent thing, and then the outdoor cafe is the use that's associated with the restaurant, that may occupy the space. So for outdoor cafes, we like them, we encourage them. We don't have that many of them, unfortunately. The very first image that you saw of Trumbull Kitchen, which is on one of the main streets in downtown, where you see that kind of pedestrian activity, is one of just a handful of restaurants where we have outdoor cafes, in part because the sidewalk there is so wide, because the building was built so far back from the street. But we encourage them, and they're just done on a case-by-case basis. Yes?
This may be beyond the scope of the work of the plan, but I'm wondering about the intersection between the stormwater conditions and the city's stormwater permit that it has to get, the Clean Water Act. I mean, one of the things I've been watching and hoping would evolve over time is that these two things would begin to sync up more, that city zoning and planning would begin to sync up with the statewide stormwater plans. And I wonder if that was something that you all delved into at all.
Yeah, so we just actually had a workshop that was very graciously offered to us through the EPA's Green and Complete Streets program. So we applied to have them come and do a technical assistance workshop. And in that workshop, we convened the state regulators, the local water utility, which is called the Metropolitan District Commission, and the local regulators of various kinds from the zoning side or Inland Wetlands Commission. So the Planning and Zoning Commission is also the Inland Wetlands Commission by charter. So our staff that deals with wetlands was there. And it was, and federal officials too that represent our region were there. And it was one of the first times I think everybody had sort of gotten into a room and to talk about green infrastructure. In that case, it was focused on streets and street design, but the issues were ended up spilling over outside of street design as well. So we're hoping that with the hire of the green infrastructure specialist as of last week, we'll be able to continue that conversation and work at different levels of government. In the case of our local water utility, they're under a consent decree and a consent order to better deal with sewer separation and stormwater management in general. So they're very interested in, and I think that they indicate that they're very interested in figuring out how green infrastructure can help them possibly meet some of those requirements, or at least, you know, provide the space for them to make a case for it. And so we think we have a few stars aligning that will help us, you know, use green infrastructure specifically to address permitting requirements, consent decrees, you know, all of that. Whether we can actually do it within the short time period of our grant for the specialist, and with the limited funding available in Hartford is another question, but we're going to make a run for it. We're going to try. It's a really important issue, especially in a dense place with clay soils like we have. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very inspiring to see that really the communities can transform cities here. I'm from Europe, so it's a bit different. But I wanted to ask you whether you were at all inspired by other cities, maybe in the country or in your state, or maybe even outside, that serve as a model on what you're trying to do? And if yes, what type of cities, or what kind of cities and elements are you looking at? Thank you.
Yeah, so every sort of one of those bullet points that was asterisk involved a pretty thorough review of the best practices in other cities for that particular goal. So for example, on green infrastructure, Philadelphia's program on green infrastructure is really highly advanced. And you know, we're not going to get there anytime soon, but it's, you know, certainly a model for us to look at. I mean, New York City has done a lot of climate planning, and we actually had a conference at the law school in March where the keynote was Nilda Mesa, who headed that office while there. Portland is an obvious choice and also participated in the conference. Actually, Boston as well is a nearby neighbor who's done a lot through the zoning code, but also through its building code. Something we don't address in the zoning code because we don't have that authority, but Boston has addressed in its building code requirements for individual buildings and their energy efficiency and the materials used and waste and all of that. So Chicago too. I mean, so, you know, a lot of the big cities have embraced these concepts, and, you know, we tried to draw from all of them to the extent that you can in a 125,000 person city. But there's a lot out there. I'm happy to either send you the students' memos or compile if you're interested in anything specific. Yeah.
This was a fairly extensive overhaul, and you must have had some resistance or naysayers. And so I'm wondering how you might have dealt with that. And I don't mean from people who just don't like change, but from people who don't like change related to addressing climate change. How did you address the public, the way that it looked to the public?
So actually, we had 3 hours of public testimony at the hearing that we were at. We had a code consultant that did a lot of the underlying work, and especially on the form-based codes. I mean, she was the one who went out and categorized our building types, created the building types. I have a whole other series of images that I could have shown on just the building type process. But she's done a lot of that, and we had 3 hours of public testimony, and she said she's never seen such a hearing because every single speaker was effusively positive about the code. So we went around, I mean, I personally went around to probably over 100 meetings with individuals, people, you know, merchants associations. I talked to the large business association, the small ones, the environmental groups, the neighborhood groups. Everybody was so excited about the code that we really didn't have any negative comments. The only negative comments that we had on the code during that public hearing were not really related to any of this. We had a couple people come and testify against a change that we made in definition of household from 2 unrelated people to 3 unrelated people. And it's a very small, you know, in the scope of all of this, you know, it's a very small point, but there's a specific issue in a specific neighborhood in Hartford that made people worried that we changed from 2 to 3. Meanwhile, no town around Hartford and no other town of our size in Connecticut has 3. It has even 2. You know, most of them have 5 or more people unrelated in the household. So, you know, we didn't think it was that radical, but that's the only thing that a couple of people came and testified against. Otherwise, we had involvement and letters of support from everybody, from the Connecticut Green Bank, Connecticut Department for the Environment, tons of the neighborhood associations that I mentioned spent time to either come and testify or write a letter, from Riverfront Recapture, from Keeney Park Sustainability Project. everybody was really excited about it. So we didn't have that problem, and I think part of it was because we could show people, you said this in your neighborhood plan, and this is how we can achieve this goal for you. If do you agree? And then we could work through it, and they would say, yes, we agree, and so, and so be it. And so we sort of went through that process. But it was a period of intense engagement, not just the open public hearings where people can put stickers on the walls and say that they like something, but it was really an intense engagement process that led to this result. And we've had very few complaints about it. We have had some complaints about the signage chapter, which I think we resolved in an amendment. But like signage is a fairly minor issue when it comes to all of this. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. So you may have come across this, but sometimes building codes and zoning codes are seen as the enemy of development. And there's some towns that are economically depressed and really want to encourage development. And so through your work and through seeing other cities' examples, have you come across environmentally friendly building and zoning codes that you find are less onerous or more easily sellable to communities that are concerned about how that might impact developers?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, even though the title of my presentation was focused on energy and environment, that's one of the reasons why I included the other stuff about reducing administrative burdens, because paired with what might have been additional requirement to say plant more trees in your parking lot, which we do have pretty robust tree planting in parking lot requirements. That costs money. You don't get the same parking spaces if you really need parking. You have to build islands that you're going to have to snow plow around, so this is a cost. But we paired that with really a significant loosening of the number and kind of projects that have to come before the commission. So, commission meetings can be scheduled and canceled because of snow. Commissioners may, go off on a tangent and require you to do something that you didn't expect to do if you're a developer. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with those kinds of public hearings. But for the projects we know that were not controversial and not of concern to neighborhoods, we said, okay, you no longer have to come to the Planning and Zoning Commission, which really fast tracks things and saves them, a lot of money because of the clarity. So I think the fact that it was a sweeping overhaul overall made the environmental provisions more palatable because we just overall reduced the cost of development. And then the parking too. I mean, we've had developers look at buildings downtown and which didn't have parking because they were built, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and pass on renovating them because they would have had to find some way to show the zoning commission that they had met whatever the old parking requirements are. So now that we've sort of just said, poof, if you're a smart developer, if you're going to develop a 100-unit apartment building, you're going to have to figure out where these people are going to park or you're not going to be viable. But we're not going to tell you that you have to do it on the lot. We're not going to tell you to build a parking garage. We do have some empty parking garages in Hartford. Go make a deal with them, see what you can figure out. And if not, make this a millennial-only building where everybody's, on their motorpeds or I don't know what they use, skateboarding, I don't know. So we kind of leave it up to them to meet that goal. Yeah.
My question is actually related to the parking, so I'm glad you segued to that. It seems like that's a great strategy to create more walkable communities, but I'm wondering how quickly do you think that's actually going to have an impact and actually reduce the number of cars that are in certain neighborhoods? And then depending on how long that takes, do you anticipate needing to increase local transit and working to find other ways for people to get there? I mean, the bike parking makes sense, but I know a lot of people also won't probably ever ride bikes. So how do you, make it easy enough for people to still want to get downtown if they can't park, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess our overall view is that the market will figure out how much parking is needed and people will start pooling parking where they need to pool parking. And so if you have, several different property owners that want to do retail or there's just some expansion of use, then they'll maybe build a decked parking, an inexpensive decked parking, in one of their lots, or they'll buy. So we kind of feel like the market will figure out what the parking requirements are, and we shouldn't impose that through zoning on individual lot owners. Like I said, we still do impose parking minimums in some places. Actually, Buffalo, going back to your question, is has eliminated parking minimums almost everywhere. And Buffalo, like Hartford, is a post-industrial city with, economic challenges, but they've done it in part to free up development costs, but also to minimize, or to structurally de-emphasize the emphasis on the car. So we might actually be following the Buffalo example at some point in the future by lifting more of our minimums. But like I said, we have maximums everywhere, which may be contradictory to what I just said about we want the market to find the minimums, but we also want to be reasonable about what the maximums are on lots. Does that answer your question? We do hope people bike too. I mean, there's a big biking culture that's emerged in Hartford. We think that the bike-friendly community designation will also build on itself. We have a pretty active Complete Streets working group. We have a nonprofit called BCCO that does bike education in the heart of one of our low-income communities, and it's just they do bike fixing, bike rides, safe biking classes. I mean, we're really starting to, I think, embrace that, and lots of people do bike because it's the most affordable form of transit. So getting to work is even more affordable than a transit pass for a lot of people. So they bike in winters. I don't bike I don't really bike much, but I mean, they bike in winters. And there's been current stories in the Hartford Current about how we have a hardy biking culture.
I know that housing costs in Hartford and Buffalo are much lower than they are in Portland or New York. One of the things that I see some of the higher housing costs the community's looking at is, thank you. So for housing costs, one way that people are addressing them is trying to do some sort of congregate housing or intentional communities. And I just heard you mention that you have a limitation of no more than 3 unrelated people living together. And I'm wondering, what would you do if a group of seniors said we want to create collective senior housing?
Yeah, so you're talking about co-housing. Yeah, so it can be configured in a variety of ways. So it could be a model where we have, a condo type community in one building, or it could be configured in a way where we have little, one-story shelters, freestanding shelters around, and a common space in the middle. So for those, for the first kind, depending on the way the building is configured in the neighborhood, that it would be allowed. If you're allowing multiple unit dwellings within that neighborhood, it's certainly allowed. If you're in a one-unit dwelling district, what other people call a single-family district, we actually scrubbed all references to family in our zoning code. So if you live in a one-unit dwelling district, it's more complicated, but we've loosened some of the requirements in those districts for accessory dwelling units. So you might be able to get, some multi-party housing even in those neighborhoods. But ideally, especially the ones with freestanding buildings located around a common room, we'd see those projects come under what we call a campus overlay, which allows for multiple buildings to be located on one site. And we do have some of those campus overlay lots that are located within neighborhoods. They're usually among the larger lots, more suitable for that kind of housing. We do have a real challenge in the neighborhood plans and elsewhere for senior housing and age-in-place type housing, so we do think that's a challenge. And we haven't found a community that is doing that in Hartford. There is one group that's starting to emerge, and they're looking at Hartford sites. I think they'll be able to find sites that are suitable to them, that are in the campus overlay or in the multi-unit dwelling districts, and so I look forward to that, actually, because it's an important and missing piece in what Hartford can offer. It is more affordable, but for senior living, we haven't seen any really senior living developments happen in the city. I think.
Thank you. My question is about the renewable energy zoning changes to facilitate developers to add renewable energy to their developments. Does the state's either net metering or renewable portfolio standards align with that in a way that developers would want to take advantage of those provisions in the code? Or are there changes that would need to happen at the state level to really facilitate the uptake of those provisions?
Yeah, so you're talking about for larger developers with multiple, let's say, apartment units or something like that?
The height of the ability to
So in the downtowns and transit-oriented development districts, where you're developing multi-tenant buildings, possibly, or maybe just its own building. So yeah, the state rules are pretty generous when it comes to net metering. A couple years ago, it passed, the state legislature passed a rule on, that would allow developers who have Class 1 renewable energy on site to sub-meter tenants for their usage of that, that energy generator. And that has been used in at least one building downtown, and we're trying to get other buildings to use that. So fuel cells are designated as a Class 1 renewable energy in Connecticut. We actually have a pretty big fuel cell industry there. So one easy way for a vertical downtown building to make Class 1 renewable energy profitable is to use a fuel cell, because it takes up so little space and generates so much energy. So we are anticipating seeing the deployment of more fuel cells, and we're hoping to give, that helps to give developers just another added reason. It's not a huge bonus, it's 2 stories, I think, but it gives them another added reason to go that route, in addition to the fact that they can sub-meter and recoup the costs that they've put into things like a fuel cell. So, and we have the Connecticut Green Bank, which is an innovator in renewable energy financing. I think that's my last question, though.
Yeah, we'll have to close it there. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
We'll see people back at the next one.
Thank you.